And but for those of you who weren't here last week, I have the pleasure of introducing again Reverend Dr. David Marshall, who's joining us from Bern, Switzerland. I won't go through his whole biography again, but just we're in good hands. That's all I have to say. He's a wonderful, has a lot of experience in the Church of England and all over the place. And last week he gave us a wonderful historical overview of some of the main traditions within Anglicanism. And this week he's going to begin by giving us some representative samples of some of those traditions, representative figures of some of those traditions. So let me hand it over to David Marshall for the talk.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicholas. And it's very good to be with you all again. So as Nicholas just said, we're going to move now from the overview to some specific examples. Today, we're going to look at two figures who represent the Anglo-Catholic tradition in the Church of England and the wider Anglican tradition. Next week, a leading liberal figure and a leading evangelical figure. And then the final session will look at one who doesn't really fit in the categories that well, but is almost certainly the most widely read Anglican ever, C.S. Lewis, who wasn't even ordained. So that's an interesting development that he's perhaps been the most widely read and most widely influential of all Anglican authors. So yes, today then, two Archbishops of Canterbury, one of whom is still living, Rowan Williams, now retired, from the Anglo-Catholic tradition. I hope you all have sight of a handout. If not, I'm sure it'll be sent to you later, so don't worry if I mention book titles that sound interesting or anything like that. It's all available to you. Firstly then, Michael Ramsey, who lived from 1904 to 1988. He's somebody who I know at least one person at your church has encountered personally. I believe Ross, who I was in touch with a week or two ago, encountered him as a schoolboy in England, which I did as well. I met him when I was a child. He's somebody around whom there's a certain mystique, a certain kind of aura of otherworldly eccentricity. There's a lot of very entertaining stories about him, some of them from the time in his retirement when he stayed for a while at Nashotah House, the Episcopal Seminary in, which state is that in? Somewhere up in the north, in the States, that is. And there's all sorts of funny stories about his time there. There isn't really much time this morning to go into those, but if you meet people who ever met him, then see if you can get some entertaining stories out of them about him. So he was born in 1904 into an academic family in Cambridge. His father was a professor. He studied then at Cambridge University himself and trained for ordination. Early on, he served in various parish and academic teaching positions. From 1940 to 1950, he was in already the quite prestigious position of a canon at Durham Cathedral and already publishing some major theological works. From 1950 to 52, he was professor of theology at Cambridge. And then he moved into really the most senior rank of the church positions as Bishop of Durham, and then as Archbishop of York, the second most senior position in the Church of England. And finally, from 1961 to 1974, he served as the 100th Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, a position that goes right back to the 6th century. So he was the 100th in succession. Note that he was the Archbishop of Canterbury during the upheavals, the colourful but also quite challenging, divisive time of the 1960s, when many issues came to the fore and the church was challenged in all kinds of ways. I'm going to mention just some of the main emphases of his time as Archbishop of Canterbury, and then mention some of his leading publications, and we'll look at a couple of quotations to illustrate something of his style. So as Archbishop, he was serving at a time of great ecumenical opening. During the 1960s, there was the famous Vatican II process in the Roman Catholic Church, which led to the great opening up of the Roman Catholic Church. And it was during that, it was shortly after Vatican II, or perhaps during, around 1965, 66, that Michael Ramsey made the first visit of an Archbishop of Canterbury since the time of the Reformation, which of course had meant a break with Rome. He was the first Archbishop of Canterbury to go to Rome and to be welcomed by the Pope in this new era of ecumenical openness and of seeking again for Christian unity. He also was the first Archbishop of Canterbury to visit the Russian Orthodox Patriarch in Moscow. He invested himself substantially in a process which ultimately failed, to his great sadness, of reunion between the Anglican and Methodist churches in England. And he also served on the great international ecumenical body, the World Council of Churches, as a president from 61 to 68. In terms of the internal business of the Church of England, I mean, this is a time, obviously the 50s, the 60s, a time of greater emphasis on, the emphasis on the lay people, and not just on the authority figures. It's a time of questioning of authority, of turning away from tradition. It's no surprise that it's during that period that the Church of England brought into being a system of government, synodical government, which gave a much more substantial role to the laity, not just the clergy and the bishops. And he was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time that move towards a more lay-centered approach to the government of the church came into being. I mentioned earlier that in many ways he comes across as a rather timeless figure, focused on eternal truths. And yet the reality, this rather paradoxical reality, was that he was a very political figure as well. He was engaged in many political issues of his time. Senior bishops of the Church of England then and still today have a seat in the House of Lords, so have a significant role in the political life of the country. And in that role, he was deeply engaged in many of the huge issues of the day, such as apartheid in South Africa, immigration to Britain, which was starting to become a major question at that time, the death penalty, and decriminalization of homosexuality. So there were all kinds of controversial, painful issues around which he was engaged. Let me mention some of his major publications. His earliest substantial publication is a book from which we're going to read a paragraph in just a moment, The Gospel and the Catholic Church. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. He also wrote a wonderful book focused on the transfiguration narrative about Christ as a way into understanding Christ and his ministry, The Glory of God and the Transfiguration of Christ. Two of the more accessible, brief works that I would say are excellent first tasters of Michael Ramsey, if you're interested in getting a sense of his writing, are The Christian Priest Today, which is a wonderful book. Here's the copy I was given at my ordination by the priest with whom I was serving. And I would say to you, if you're ever if you know somebody who's about to be ordained and you're looking for inspiration, if you can't think of anything else, no harm giving them a copy of this. It's a wonderful book for every priest to have, but it's well worth lay people reading as well. Very profound, simple, remarkably simple, accessible statements about the ministry of the church as it's focused in the work of the priest. And then finally, a book called Be Still and Know, which is a book about prayer. And he, particularly in his retirement, I think led many retreats. He was a very prayerful, spiritual, contemplative figure. Now, on the second side of your handout, I have included a couple of quotations from his work. And the longer one, the first one, is one that I want to particularly draw attention to because it illustrates the way in which the Anglican Church, at least in theory, seeks to hold together the Reformed or evangelical together with the Catholic, or in Anglican terms, Anglo-Catholic impulses. Michael Ramsey is fundamentally an Anglo-Catholic. He's on that side, he's on that wing of the church. But this remarkable book, The Gospel and the Catholic Church, is an attempt to try and make clear to both evangelical and Anglo-Catholic Anglicans how much they need each other, that these are two complementary wings. I mean, wings are necessarily complementary. A bird can't fly with one wing. And in a way, that's what he's saying about the church. It needs both the evangelical emphasis about the gospel, and it needs the Catholic emphasis about the ordered life and the continuous life of the church and its structures and its official ministry. Let's read this passage and see what he's doing here. When reunion has been discussed, there has often seemed to be an impasse between two types of Christianity. On the one hand, there is the Catholic tradition, which thinks of the church as a divine institution, the gift of God to man, and which emphasizes outward order and continuity and the validity of its ministry and sacraments. On the other hand, there is the evangelical tradition, which sees the divine gift not in the institution, but in the gospel of God, and which thinks less of church than of the word of God and of justification by faith. This tradition, the evangelical tradition, finds it hard to understand the Catholic's thought and language about order and validity and his insistence upon the historic episcopate. The two traditions puzzle one another. The one seems legalistic, the other seems individualistic. I think that's a brilliantly and rather beautifully expressed statement of this fundamental tension that there is within Anglicanism. If I think of my congregation here, our congregation here, doubtless your congregation, pretty well any congregation anywhere in the Anglican Communion, you're always going to have people from these two wings of the church together. If we were just to ask you, amongst those of you gathered here today, I expect those of you in your own formative experience of the church may have come up through strongly Protestant experiences or through more Catholic environment. And you will know something of how the other strand of the church can seem, as he says, very puzzling. And I think he expresses beautifully in this book how they fundamentally belong together. Fundamentally, what he does in this book is he begins by saying that the church has its very being, exists as a fact, ultimately because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he's immediately using language and concepts which appeal deeply to and resonate deeply with the evangelical sense that the death and resurrection of Jesus, the heart of the gospel, is really the fundamental thing for Christians to grasp onto. But then almost immediately he moves to the complementary fact that the gospel is not some kind of disembodied message which can exist independently of the church. The church is not just a convenient means for getting the message of the gospel across, but is integral to the gospel. Gospel and church are mutually interpenetrating, totally interwoven realities. So he goes on to say, in a way that evangelical Christians might find stretching them a bit, that the gospel requires the church, and the church requires church order. And then, and this is probably the biggest ask for some people in the evangelical tradition, church order requires the ministry of bishops. And so he reaches the point where he says that the episcopate is an expression of the gospel. To have an episcopally led church, a church led by bishops, is itself an expression of the gospel. So that is how he seeks to weave the two strands of Anglicanism together. It's a very rich read, and I commend it. If I've given a sense of what's going on there that interests you, I commend that book to you. Rather more briefly and I think a bit more simply, but at the same time, typically Ramsey here uses simple language under which there is great profundity. This is a little quotation from the book The Christian Priest Today, where he speaks about the fact that at their ordination, every priest is called, promises that they will be diligent in their prayers. And he elaborates on this and what is involved, and particularly on the theme of intercession. He writes this: "We are called near to Jesus and with Jesus and in Jesus to be with God, with the people on our heart. That is what you will be promising when I say to you, will you be diligent in prayers? you will be promising to be daily with God, with the people on your heart. Just to interject there, each of the chapters of this book are short addresses which he as Archbishop gave to people about to be ordained as priests. So he's speaking to them on the day before their ordination. And he's saying, tomorrow I'm going to say to you, will you be diligent in prayers? And this is what it will mean for you. And he goes on, your prayer will be a rhythmic movement of all your powers, moving into the divine presence in contemplation and moving into the needs of the people in intercession. In contemplation, you will reach into the peace and stillness of God's eternity. In intercession, you will reach into the rough and tumble of the world of time and change. And again, you get there that coming together in this remarkable man of God of some eternity and the rough and tumble of this world. He was a man deeply rooted in silent contemplative prayer, and yet also deeply engaged in the challenges, the suffering of the world today. Well, there you are, just a very brief taste of Michael Ramsey, but I hope I've said enough to give you some impression of the man and hopefully some pointers towards exploring him further. I've just included at the bottom there a link for an interview with Michael Ramsey carried out in New York during a visit he made to New York as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1968 on a show which maybe I don't know if this is a famous TV show, the Dick Cavett Show. I found this online, and it gives quite a sense of Michael Ramsey. If you want to hear him speaking, that's not a bad place to start. So moving on to the other figure for today, about 50 years younger, another Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams was born in 1950 in Wales into a Welsh-speaking Presbyterian family, and he's fluent in Welsh and translates poetry from Welsh, and his Welsh identity is very important for him. Although he was the leader of the Church of England, he is decidedly not English. He is Welsh. He studied theology at Cambridge and wrote a doctorate on Russian Orthodox theology, trained for ordination, and then really went into an academic career. He, very young, was made a professor at Oxford, and then moved back to his native Wales as a bishop, becoming Archbishop of Wales. One or two examples of political involvement and how he got caught up in the dramatic happenings of the world of his time. In 1985, still as a young scholar, he was arrested along with colleagues of his and fined for involvement in demonstration against nuclear weapons. And in a slightly different kind of encounter, well, in 2001, on the very day, 9/11, he was at a famous church, the name now, I forget the name now, in New York City, when the two towers were hit, and they were stuck there for a couple of hours, and he had this quite, I think it was touch and go whether they would be able to escape safely, but obviously he did, and he wrote about his reflections that day in a little booklet called Writing in the Dust. He became Archbishop of Canterbury in 2002, served for 10 years before retiring from that position rather earlier than he needed to and returning to academic work at Cambridge. He's now fully retired, but incredibly active. Whereas there's not a lot online one can find with Michael Ramsey, just the occasional interview on YouTube, there's a huge amount out there about Rowan Williams. He's much in demand and invited to speak on all kinds of topics. He mentioned some of the main issues that arose and some of his main emphases as Archbishop of Canterbury. Right at the beginning of his time, the UK supported the USA in the Iraq War. He was critical of that stance. It was a very difficult beginning, even at the very day that he was being enthroned as Archbishop of Canterbury. That was happening in the background, and so he was thrown straight into the political maelstrom. There was also maelstroms in the life of the church. The crisis that came to a head during his time was that of same-sex relationships and marriage. His situation here was a complex one, which I think a lot of people found hard to understand. He was well known before he became Archbishop of Canterbury as a scholar. It was well known that he had written in support of a progressive position, supporting the case for the church's acknowledgement that same-sex relationships could be a valid option for Christians. And I give a reference to a famous lecture he gave on this point, which is often referred to as the single most influential argument for a change in the church's traditional opposition to same-sex relationships. But when he became Archbishop of Canterbury, he did not see this as an opportunity to push his own agenda. He saw his job as one who was the convener of the whole church, if you like, the one who held together the conversation of the whole church and needed to help all the different strands of the church understand each other. His more liberal friends and colleagues, who rather imagined that he would push forward with change in this area of the church, were somewhat disappointed, perhaps bitterly disappointed with him. The Episcopal Church was, I think, very disappointed that he didn't more warmly support them in the position that the Episcopal Church took. Rather, his appeal was that the churches should wait for one another, and particularly the churches that wanted to move ahead fast should listen to the other churches and move together with them. So he was thereby emphasizing unity as integral to the witness of the church. His whole tenure was dominated by this debate. The meeting of the Anglican bishops from around the world, the Lambeth Conference, over which he presided in 2008, was already one at which the cracks were becoming quite evident, because many of the provinces of the Anglican Communion, particularly in Africa, were very critical of the church in Canada, in the USA, and in other provinces where same-sex relationships had been accepted. And Rowan Williams was criticized by both sides, by the liberal side for not supporting them in the way that they'd expected that he would, by the more conservative side for not being harsher with the liberal side. He seeking to maintain a dialogue, and to some extent that succeeded. He did manage to preside over a Lambeth Conference, which brought together most of the bishops of the Anglican Communion, but it was a time of pain and controversy. He was also a man of dialogue. In particular, I mean, I was on his staff as the interreligion expert resource person for dialogue with Jews and Muslims in particular, and I worked with him closely on a number of dialogues with people of other faiths, and particularly with Muslims. He also, in his years as Archbishop of Canterbury, had a number of high-profile conversations with people of very different outlooks. Online, you can find a video of an interview of a mediated conversation between him and the atheist scientist Richard Dawkins. I think Richard Dawkins is at his most respectful and restrained in his conversation with Rowan Williams, which I think is probably a tribute to Williams, that Dawkins realized that he couldn't be perhaps quite as sort of as brusque and aggressive as he was with perhaps more often. Also with the novelist Philip Pullman, a very interesting interview, another atheist, very critical of Christianity. The style of Rowan Williams is to enter into a deep dialogue with people like that, who might seem to have nothing to do with Christianity, no interest in it other than to reject it. He has a quite extraordinary capacity to get inside their thinking and explore even some areas of commonality. At times he's got into controversy. Perhaps his capacity to engage in dialogue, from the point of view of some people, goes too far. He gave a lecture in Britain in 2008 in which he sought to explain why he thought that some aspects of Islamic law, Sharia, could be incorporated into British law. it was a fairly subtle argument it was a very subtle argument that he was making. A number of people were horrified by what they understood, probably misunderstood him as saying. But it's an example of how somebody with quite extraordinary intellectual powers perhaps sometimes overestimates the intelligence and the sympathy with which others will listen. I think from time to time he was disappointed in his time as Archbishop of Canterbury by the way that the media misrepresented what he was saying. A brief introduction to some of his writing, which is huge. From my experience of working with him for a few years, I can honestly say that with the exception of sport, which is, I think, a subject on which he showed no interest, he was interested in and widely knowledgeable about pretty well every aspect of public life and could speak on all kinds of social and political issues very knowledgeably. But he also writes about core Christian theological matters. I mentioned some of his notable theological works here. I mentioned an early book of his on the resurrection of Christ, and I've just included a quotation on this at the end, which I think may be interesting for you to see. Some of you may know the name Bishop John Spong, who I believe died in the last year or two, an outstanding figure in the Episcopal Church, particularly associated with the liberal revisionist school of thought, who did not believe in a literal resurrection of Christ. And there's a little note here on an episode between Spong and the much younger theologian, as he then was, Rowan Williams. Bishop John Spong once accused Williams of being a neo-medievalist. This is right at the end of the handout, in case you're wondering, that Williams was preaching orthodoxy to the people in the pew, but knowing in private that it's not true. But in an interview with a Christian journal, Third Way, Rowan Williams commented, "I am genuinely a lot more conservative than Spong would like me to be. Take the resurrection. I think he has said that, of course, I know what all the reputable scholars think on the subject, and therefore when I talk about the risen body of Jesus, I must mean something other than the empty tomb. But I don't. I mean the empty tomb. I don't know how to persuade Spong that that's what I mean, but I really don't." This is interesting as well, because, as I mentioned earlier, he's associated with some liberal causes, such as on the question of same-sex relationships and marriage. But fundamentally, on the questions of the creed, he is traditional. He believes in the resurrection of Jesus, believes in the virgin birth of Jesus, not just as myths, not just as poetical ways of expressing religious ideas, spiritual truths. He believes in them literally. So he's an interesting mixture of theological conservatism and, in some ways, political radicalism. And in that respect, is not unlike Michael Ramsey before him. One or two other books of his. I mentioned a couple of introductions to Christianity aimed at a wider readership. If you'd like to find a way into Rowan Williams's writing, and I must warn you, some of his writing can be really quite challenging and daunting, but these two books, Tokens of Trust, A Simple Introduction to the Christian Faith, and Being Christian, would be an interesting and I think quite accessible way into his writing. Prayer and Spirituality, as for Michael Ramsey, very important strand of his work. He has a beautiful book about the Desert Fathers, a tradition from the early Egyptian Christian tradition. In the UK, the title is Silence and Honeycakes. I believe that in the US it might be published under a different title, but it's a beautifully simple but profound book. He's also written books on icons. Like Michael Ramsey, he's the kind of person who much in demand as a spiritual director and as a spiritual retreat conductor. In more recent times, well, throughout his time as Archbishop of Canterbury, he strongly emphasized the challenge to the church and the wider world of the environment. Since his retirement, he's been even more explicit in his engagement here. He's been publicly present in demonstrations supporting, for example, the organization Extinction Rebellion. Final aspect of his work that I'd like to draw attention to, he's a man of literature. He writes poetry himself. He's fascinated by literature. He's even written plays. He's translated poetry from Welsh and so on. He's written a number of books about literary figures. I've not read it, but his book on Dostoevsky, which he wrote in a few weeks during a sabbatical, while Archbishop of Canterbury, is highly praised. And I mentioned one or two others there. In particular, you may enjoy his book on C.S. Lewis. If you're a lover of C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis is not the kind of writer who theologians, high-powered, sophisticated theologians, would normally want to confess to admiring. C.S. Lewis is typically dismissed as a bit of a kind of populist, somebody who oversimplifies things. Rowan Williams has the highest respect for him, not uncritical, but deep respect for him. And he wrote a book on his Narnia stories called The Lion's World, which is very interesting indeed, and I would strongly recommend that. In fact, I'm going to suggest that I close my comments with just a look at him from a short video clip, which I think Nicholas is going to play for us now, from a visit he made to a church in the States just a few years ago, and afterwards they had a conversation about Narnia. And here's a little section of him answering the question, what's his favorite episode in the Narnia books? There we are. I couldn't hear that, but I'm assuming you all could do. So, Nicholas, I'm done. That was an inevitably very brief and rather superficial introduction to these two huge figures in the Anglican tradition, but I hope it at least gave you an impression of these two, and I'd be very happy now to take any comments or any questions that anyone would like to add.
All right, thank you very much, David. Any questions? Or comments? Yes, John.
When he was talking about Michael Ramsey and the tension between the evangelical and the church, doesn't Paul talk about bishops in some of his letters? Is that something that's...
Yeah, indeed. Michael Ramsey, in that section of the church, the gospel in the Catholic Church, he roots a lot of what he has to say in an exposition of 1 Corinthians, which is a letter which is, and the point he makes is, if you read 1 Corinthians, in one sense, it's all about the gospel, but it's also all about the church. I don't think he mentions bishops there, but there is a word in Greek, episkopos, from which we get episcopal, which literally means overseer. That's what episcope means. It means oversight. So the person who has oversight in the church. Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox translate that word as bishop. If you're a member of a radical sort of, Mennonite church or some other, sort of non-episcopal Protestant church, you would say, well, that's not necessarily what it means. Episcopacy of some kind emerges fairly early on in the church, but the New Testament doesn't itself state explicitly the fully formed version of the threefold order of ministry that we have in the Anglican Church and which the Roman Catholic Church has of deacons, priests, and bishops. That is something which emerged fairly early on in the church's tradition. And if you're a Catholic, whether in an Anglican or a Catholic or a Roman Catholic form, you would accept that as a legitimate development of the roots in the New Testament. But there's room for a debate there. Otherwise, it would have been settled long ago.
Any other questions or comments? Out of curiosity, how many of you have been exposed to the writings of either one of these people, Michael Ramsey or Rowan Williams? A little bit, maybe. So just out of, these are obviously huge figures in the Anglican tradition, writing on a whole variety of different topics. And if you're ever looking for that Advent book or that Lenten book, each one of these has wonderful, on just every topic you can imagine, wonderful treatments, some at the very academic level and some at a very popular level. So
and I was keen, thank you. Yeah, and I was keen to emphasize that, Rowan Williams, I must be clear, some of his writing, frankly, I struggle to follow. Some of his more philosophical work is very complex. But that's partly why I included that little clip of him talking about C.S. Lewis, particularly when he's in a kind of in a more just with a local church, whatever. He's beautifully simple while still profound in his communication. There's a huge amount of stuff online about with him doing that kind of thing. So if for example you're interested in Lewis, there's several interviews with him about C.S. Lewis. And what he is tending to produce now is a number of books which are quite short and which are probably, what's happened is he's given a few talks somewhere and they've recorded the talks and they've transcribed it and they've published it as a little book of about 80 to 100 pages. And as you say, Nicholas, it makes a very nice Advent read. A lot of these books, like Being Christian, Being Disciples, yep, and so on. There's a number of these books today which are a very good way into his work.
And for those of you who are planning on taking part in, we're having an icon writing workshop in January. And if you're interested in possibly doing that, or if you know that you're going to participate anyway, two of the books that are written here are wonderful. The one I've read is The Dwelling of the Light, which is just a wonderful short little introduction to iconography and as a Christian spiritual discipline. How do we enter into it? How do we engage with it in a prayerful way? Last questions or comments? David, thank you so much again. I look forward to next week. We're still on for our two.
Yes. So next week we'll be looking at two figures. John Robinson was a radical liberal figure who wrote a book called Honest to God, published in 1963, which caused huge furore. It was understood as saying God is dead. Traditional ideas of God were dead anyway. And then in contrast, a much more conservative figure, John Stott, who is the kind of doyen, the leading figure of Anglican evangelical renewal in the second part of the 20th century. So two quite different accounts of how the church should think, what message it should be proclaiming to the world, both within Anglicanism.
That's right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your time with us today.
Good. Have a good Sunday. Bye.